everybody, how's it going? I'm Paul, I'm with the DiceyReview.com, and tonight we're going to be looking at the 1 to 4 player game Indian Summer. This game was designed by Uwe Rosenberg and is released by Stronghold Games and Spielweiss. Now before we look at setup, it might be a good idea to give a brief overview of what we're trying to accomplish in this game. Each player will have a forest floorboard with 6 unique sections. There are also many treasures depicted on each of the player boards. Players are going to be placing tiles on their turns to cover up the different spaces on the board. There's going to be a hole in each one of the tiles that a player can place. As you can see from this placement, the player was able to cover one of the mushroom treasures with the hole in this tile. When a treasure is covered in this way, one of the tokens from the supply will be placed on top of the hole. Players will continue to place tiles on their board trying to cover it completely. Ideally, they will want to cover as many of the treasure spaces with a hole in one of the tiles as they can. Although, as you can see from this example, sometimes it's not possible. When one of the 6 sections is completely covered by tiles, whether it be leaf tiles or squirrel tiles, all of the accumulated treasure tokens will then be collected by the player. These treasure tokens will give players special abilities that will allow them to cover their forest floor faster. The first player to completely cover their forest floor is the winner. It's important to note that the treasure tokens are not victory points. They're just used in case of tiebreakers, so you want to try and use them as much as you can to gain the most advantages. Now that we've looked at a brief overview of what we're trying to accomplish, let's look at how to set the game up. To begin setup for Indian Summer, shuffle the 6 different forest floorboards and give 1 to each player. In this example, we're setting up for a 2-player game. Next, give each player a backpack token. They'll place this next to the bottom left corner of their forest floorboard. The game comes with 2 game boards, and they're double-sided, one for the solitaire version of the game and one for the multiplayer version. Find the multiplayer version sides of the board and then set them in the middle of the play area between all players. The multiplayer game board has multiple outlines for animal tiles. Find the corresponding animal tiles and place them in the outlined spaces. When you're done, it should look like this. There's an additional step to set up for this part. As you can see, the larger 3 animal tiles on the right side of the board have a treasure token with an arrow pointing towards them. Now we'll get into details about what treasure tokens are and how they can help later in the explanation, but for now just know that you need to place one of the depicted treasure tokens on each of the animal tiles on the right side of the board. As you can see, we've placed the depicted treasure tokens on the animal tiles. Next, shuffle the leaf tiles. Allow each player to draw 5 random leaf tiles, making sure that they draw 2 green tiles, 2 orange tiles, and 1 red tile. The leaf tiles need to be placed next to the player's backpack, with the green tiles on the left, followed by the orange tiles, and then finally the red tile at the end of the line, or on the right side. This line of tiles is called the player path. From the remaining shuffled leaf tiles, form a circle around the main playing board. This circle of tiles needs to be random as you see here. You'll need to leave a small gap in the circle. We'll explain why you do that here in just a moment. There will be some leftover tiles. You can place them near the playing area as they will be used throughout the game. This incomplete circle of leaf tiles is called the common path. Assemble the bush token that comes with the game and place it near the end of the line. Place the squirrel tokens and the treasure tokens within easy reach of both players. Next, give each player 1 acorn, mushroom, and berry treasure token. Finally, the last player to have taken a stroll in the forest is given the hiking shoes token and is the start player. Now that we've looked at setup for the game, let's look at the game flow and how it plays. Beginning with the start player, each player will take 1 turn in clockwise order. On a player's turn, they will take a main action. This is mandatory. A player can't pass. Before and or after the player's main action, they can execute as many special actions as they like. For a player's main action, they have one of 2 options. A player can either take one of the available leaf tiles from their player path and place it on the forest floor board, or the player can take one of the squirrel tokens from the common supply and place it on one of the spaces of their forest floor board. Let's look at the first option, placing a leaf tile. Let's say that the player selected this leaf tile to place on their player board. This will leave a gap in their player path, and it might be useful until players are used to the flow of the game to slide any tiles creating a gap to close that gap. Now when you're placing a leaf tile on your forest floor board, there are a few tile placement rules you need to take into account. Tiles have to be placed on empty spaces, so to start the game we have no covered tiles, but as the game progresses, more and more of these spaces will be covered. If a space on your board is covered with either a squirrel token or another leaf tile, you cannot place one of your leaf tiles on that location. You can place your tiles over the pre-printed treasures. You're allowed to place the hole in the leaf tile over one of the printed treasures. You're also allowed to cover the printed treasures with the solid spaces in the tile as well. It's also legal to cover an empty space with one of the holes in the leaf tiles. This is obviously not ideal, but you can do it if you need to cover a space on your board. It's also important to note that you don't have to stay within one section. You can place your tile so that it crosses the section lines. Leaf tiles can only be placed on your forest floorboard, and they can only be placed during your main action. It's also important to note that you don't have to place tiles in an adjacent manner. As you can see from this squirrel token, you can place tiles even if they're not next to one of your previously placed leaf tiles. Now I've placed some different tiles on the board here so that we can look at some examples of how you cannot place a leaf tile. You can't place a tile in a way that would cause it to cover one of a previously placed animal tile. You can't place a tile if it would cover a squirrel token or another leaf tile. You can never place a tile if it would extend off of the edge of the board. And once you place tiles, they cannot be moved later. Squirrel tokens have the same placement restriction as leaf tiles. You can't place them in a way that would cause them to cover other previously placed tiles. There is another type of tile that you saw a moment ago, an animal tile, and we'll get into more detail about how animal tiles are placed and what benefits they give you in a moment. As we stated earlier in the video, whenever you place a leaf tile and the hole in the tile covers one of the pre-printed treasures, you get to cover that pre-printed treasure with one of the tokens matching the symbol. In this instance, we get to place a feather token on top of this leaf tile. If you place one of your leaf tiles in a way that would cause the hole in the tile to cover an empty space with no pre-printed treasure, you don't get any tokens for doing that. Tokens within a section will begin to pile up until the section is completed. Each section consists of 12 squares. As you can see here, this bottom middle section is completely covered. It's important to note that spaces covered by holes in a leaf tile, such as this tile right here, are still considered covered. So in this example, this section would be completely covered, and when that happens, players are allowed to take all of the treasure tokens that have been placed on tiles in this section and place them in their supply. The players would be able to use those tokens immediately if they wanted to. On their turn as a main action, if a player wants to, instead of placing one of the tiles on their player path, they can take a squirrel token from the common supply and place it on one of the spaces on their board. For instance, this player only has one square left in their bottom left section to complete that section. So as their main action, this player decides to take one of the squirrel tokens from the common supply and place it instead of one of their leaf tiles from their player path. This completes this section, allowing the player to take the 2 tokens that have been placed here. Now that we've looked at the 2 main actions that a player can take on their turn, and a few of the different tile placement rules and how to complete sections and gain treasure tokens, let's look at a special tile, one of the animal tiles. There are a number of different animal tiles that are placed in the middle of the table from the start of the game. These tiles can be placed on top of previous leaf tiles on a player's forest floorboard if a few conditions are met. Let's look at those conditions now. Animal tiles can be placed on a player's turn as an additional free action. Placing an animal tile does not take up a player's main action. It's just a free additional action that a player can do if their player board meets a few requirements. At any time during their turn, a player can place one animal tile over an outline of continuous empty holes in leaf tiles. Since there is an outline of holes in leaf tiles that matches one of the animal tiles on the board, the player can place the animal tile over this outline of empty holes. As you can see, it doesn't matter if the player has covered a depicted treasure token or not. As long as the holes in the leaf tiles form a continuous outline that matches one of the animal tiles, that tile can be placed. It's important to note that to be able to place an animal tile, there can be no treasure tokens left on the spaces where the player wants to place their tile. So essentially, the sections have to be completed before players can place an animal tile on top of this outline. When a player covers an outline with an animal tile, they are allowed to gain the treasure tokens that are shown one more time. So for instance, this player has already gained the berry, the mushroom, and the acorn token from these 3 treasure spaces. But if they cover these spaces with an animal tile, they would gain those treasures again. It's also important to note that a player can cover a section of the outline, not covering the outline completely. So in this case, a player could just choose to cover these 3 and not cover this 4th space if they wanted to. Now that we've looked at all of the different placement examples, let's briefly discuss what happens if a player runs out of tiles on their player path. If a player were to place their last tile from their player path, they would then immediately refill their player path from the common path. To do this, a player would take the first tile in the common path in clockwise direction from the bush and place it in the first space of their player path. After doing this, the player would move the bush to the next space on the common path. They would then repeat this step until they have 5 tiles in their player path. It's important that when doing this, the players don't change the order in the common path, and they don't change the order of the tiles in their player path. They place them from left to right exactly how they were on the common path. If the common path is ever reduced to less than 7 leaf tiles, you will immediately refill the common path in this way. Take the tiles that were set aside during setup and start placing them to form a new incomplete circle around the middle of the playing area. So when you're done, it should look something like this. You would then continue to play. If there are no more leaf tiles available to refill the common path, you refill as many as possible. And if there are ever too few leaf tiles in the common path to fully refill your player path, refill it as much as possible. As you can see, this player's treasure tokens are starting to pile up. So let's briefly look at the different treasure tokens and what they allow you to do. Treasure tokens allow you to either take special actions or alternative main actions. A berry token allows a player to refill their player path. To do this, a player would return a berry token to the common supply and then refill their player path from the common path. If the player path is full, a player can return a berry token to the supply to gain a 6th tile at the end of their player path. This is the only way that a player can ever have 6 tiles, and they're limited to 6. So if a player had 6 tiles in front of them, they couldn't take the special action with a berry anymore. Acorn tokens allow a player to place a squirrel token. This is not considered a main action, this is a special additional action. So a player could take their acorn token, return it to the supply, and then immediately take a squirrel token, which they could place on their board. They can do this as many times as they want as long as they have the tokens to pay for it. Mushroom tokens allow you to take an alternative main action. So spending this token will replace your normal place a tile or place a squirrel token main action step. When a player returns a mushroom token to the supply, they are allowed to take the first tile from the player path of 2 different players. They are then allowed to place those tiles in whatever order they wish on their player board. So in a 3 or a 4 player game, a player could take the first tile from the player to their right and the player across the table. In a 2 player game, like the example that we have here, a player would be able to take the first tile from the player path of their opponent, and then they would also be able to take the first tile from the common path next to the bush. If a player is ever unable to place one of the tiles that they would want to take, they can choose to not take that tile instead. If a player uses a feather token, they are able to place 2 of the tiles from their player path on their turn as their main action. The feather token also replaces the main action, similar to the mushroom token. It's important to note that the players can place these tiles in whatever order they choose, just like with their main action. And it's also important to note that a player can only use the feather token if they have at least 2 tiles in their player path. A player has no limit to the amount of treasure tokens that they can have, and it's also important to note that at any time on a player's turn, they can exchange treasure tokens based on this conversion table right here. As you can see, a treasure token can always be exchanged for a token that is less valuable. So for instance, a feather tile could always be exchanged for a mushroom tile could always be exchanged for an acorn, and so on. Alternatively, a player can exchange 2 tokens of the same type to gain 1 token that is more valuable, 1 step up. So for instance, a player could exchange 2 berries to gain an acorn, 2 acorns to gain a mushroom, or 2 mushrooms to gain a feather. Gameplay continues until one player completely covers their board. So let's say in this example that the opposite player has completed their board and triggered the end of the game. If this happens, you would finish the current round up to the player to the right of the start player. So essentially you want to make sure that everyone has an equal number of turns. After this is done, players will use any remaining tokens they have to try and cover floor spaces with squirrels. They can do this by following the normal conversion rules. So in this instance, the player would exchange these 2 mushrooms for 2 acorn tokens. Now that they have 3 acorn tokens, they could use them to place squirrels onto their forest floorboard and try and complete as many sections as possible. For instance, placing a squirrel token here would complete this top left section. If this happens, players will be able to gain these tokens that were on their board and then use them to continue to fill in empty spaces on their board. So in this instance, a player could place 4 more squirrel tokens now. As you can see, during this end step, this player was able to completely cover their board. They were able to do so and have 3 acorn tokens left over. The player who covered their forest floor completely with leaf tiles and squirrel tiles wins the game. If more than one player has completely covered their forest floor, they add up the acorns in their supply to resolve any ties. The winner is the player with the most acorns. If any players have empty spaces remaining on their forest floors, the remaining players are ranked based on the fewest remaining empty spaces. Alright everybody, that was our video. Thanks so much for watching. We hope that it was helpful and we hope that it was informative. If you have any questions, please feel free to leave a comment in the video below or reach out to us at thedicey@gmail.com. If you want to hear more from the Dicey Review, you can listen to our podcast. It's on iTunes, Stitcher, or TuneIn. You can read our written reviews at our website, thedicey.review.com, and as always, you can feel free to connect with us at our BGG Guild. It's under Guilds, Podcasts, and the Dicey Review. Thanks so much for watching. Until next time, we'll see you at the table.